I'm going to have to ask you to step outside, sir. The man behind the counter said it the way people say things they've rehearsed. Smooth, practiced, with just enough warmth on top to make the coldness underneath harder to name. He was looking at the man in the gray canvas jacket and faded jeans the way you look at weather you've already decided you don't want to deal with. Not with cruelty, exactly. With dismissal, which is its own kind of cruelty. The man in the gray jacket looked at him. He didn't say anything. We have an appointment in progress and we're not taking walk-ins at this time. There are several other fine retailers on Colorado Boulevard that might better suit your needs today. Still nothing. Just that look. The room had gone completely still. 6 other customers. Not one of them moving. Not one of them speaking. Every single person in that room was holding their breath because they had all just understood. In the way you understand things before your brain has finished processing them, that the man in the gray jacket was Keanu Reeves, and the man behind the counter had just told him to leave. What happened next was not what anyone expected. It was quieter than that. It was more patient than that. And it would take 3 months, 1 journalist, and a piece of paper filed in a courthouse in Los Angeles County before anyone fully understood what it was. The store was called Harrington and Cole. If you lived in Pasadena, California, you knew the name the way you know certain names in a city. Not necessarily because you'd been there, but because it existed as a fixed point on a particular map. A map not of streets, but of status, of arrival, of the kind of discretionary spending that signals without announcement that you have moved beyond a certain threshold of concern. It sat at the end of Old Town Pasadena's Colorado Boulevard, in a building that had been a bank in a previous life and still carried the architectural authority of that history. Vaulted ceilings, marble floors, display cases lit from below with the careful, reverent precision of a museum. Watches and jewelry resting on velvet pads, as though they were not objects to be purchased, but artifacts to be considered. Each one attended by a small white card, handwritten, with a number on it that most people would require a moment to be sure they had read correctly. The store had been in business for 31 years. It had dressed the wrists and necks of studio executives, film directors, surgeons, architects, and the kind of quietly wealthy people who preferred not to discuss their wealth, but had strong opinions about mechanical movements and the difference between a well-lugged case and a poorly designed one. It did not advertise. It did not need to. On a Thursday morning in October, Keanu Reeves walked through the front door. He was wearing what he almost always wore when he was not being photographed for a reason: faded jeans, a plain dark t-shirt. Faded jacket, slightly worn at the elbows, the kind of jacket that has been on a few thousand miles of road and shows it. Worn motorcycle boots. No sunglasses, no watch, no signal of any visible kind that this was anyone other than a man in his late 50s who had come in from the California morning. Behind him, staying close to the entrance with the particular stillness of some 7 years' reading rooms, was his friend and longtime driver, Jay Sutton. A compact, unhurried man in his early 60s with careful eyes and the quality of presence that comes from spending decades being attentive without being noticed. Keanu was not here for himself. He was here because of Eleanor Voss. Eleanor Voss was 72 years old. She had spent the better part of 4 decades running a small repertory theater in Vancouver, British Columbia called the Meridian Stage. It occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse in a neighborhood that had been unfashionable when Eleanor opened it and had become fashionable in recent years, which she found both gratifying and faintly annoying. The Meridian seated 118 people. It had never been profitable in any conventional sense. It had been continuously in operation for 39 years, which, in the theater world, is its own form of defiance. Eleanor had not made a fortune. She had made something else. She had made a room where young actors came when they had nowhere else to go and left, sometimes years later, with something they couldn't entirely explain but couldn't do without. A foundation, a vocabulary, a way of understanding what it meant to be present in a scene that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with truth. Keanu Reeves had come to the Meridian Stage at 19 years old. He had come because he had nowhere else to go. He had stayed because Eleanor Voss had looked at him, not at what he might become, not at the raw material, but at him, and had said, on his third day of rehearsal for a production that he was almost certainly not ready for, "You're doing something very right, and you don't know what it is yet. Let's find it." He had never forgotten those words, not through the 30-something years that followed, not through everything that came after. Eleanor was ill. She had been diagnosed 14 months ago. The kind of illness that is serious enough that everyone in her life had been doing the quiet arithmetic of time and finding the numbers uncomfortable. She was still working, still coming in most mornings, still running rehearsals with the same precise, unhurried attention she had brought to every rehearsal for 39 years. But there were days when the tiredness was visible in a way it hadn't been before, and the people who loved her were paying attention in a different way than they had before. Keanu had called her 3 weeks ago. They had talked for an hour, the way they talked, unhurriedly, about theater and films, and the particular challenge of staying present in your work, where the world keeps producing louder and louder reasons to be anywhere else. At the end of the call, Eleanor had mentioned, with no particular emphasis, that she'd always wanted one of those old Patek Philippe pieces, the dress watches with the simple dials. She'd seen one in an auction catalog. She had laughed when she said it. The way you laugh when you mention something you've wanted for a long time, without ever quite permitting yourself to want it. That laugh was still in Keanu's chest 3 weeks later when he walked through the door of Harrington and Cole. Preston Hale was 49 years old. He had been the floor manager of Harrington and Cole for 11 years. In that time, he had built what he considered to be an excellent sense of the room. He could look at a person walking through the door and form, within approximately 3 seconds, a reliable assessment of their intent, their budget, and their fit within the particular social register that Harrington and Cole maintained. He was proud of this skill. It was, in his private understanding of his professional life, the central competency that distinguished a good luxury retail manager from a merely adequate one. The ability to read people quickly, accurately, and without the sentimental inefficiency of giving everyone the benefit of a doubt they hadn't earned. He had grown up in Glendale, not wealthy Glendale, the other part. His father had sold insurance. His mother had worked at a dentist until her knees gave out and then had worked as a cashier until she retired. He had understood from early that the world was organized into rooms, and that some rooms were harder to get into than others, and that the difficulty was, in his private view, largely the point. He had worked his way into those rooms. Through retail management, through relentless attention to pretension and language and the small signals of belonging that the genuinely wealthy broadcast without effort, and that he had learned, over years of careful study, to imitate with sufficient accuracy. He had arrived. He was inside the room, and he had discovered, in the way that people who fight their way into rooms often discover, that the surest way to feel securely inside a room is to control who else gets in. He was good at this. He had turned away people before. Not rudely, that was the amateur approach. The approach of someone who hadn't understood the architecture of the thing. You did it smoothly, professionally, with just enough warmth to make the cold impossible to fully name. You redirected. You suggested alternatives. You made the person feel, if you were skilled enough, that it had somehow been their own choice to leave. He had done it to a young couple in matching running shoes who had come in on a Saturday afternoon, to a heavy-set man in a polo shirt who had asked about a watch for his wife's anniversary and left without anything because Preston had managed the interaction just carefully enough to ensure that the man's enthusiasm card entered in because produce discomfort before he could produce his card. He had done it to an older woman who had come in on a weekday, alone, in clothes that suggested nothing about her finances one way or the other. She had left, quietly, without a scene. Preston had found out 3 weeks later, from a colleague, that she was the widow of a film producer whose estate had been valued at something in the vicinity of $40 million. He had experienced a brief, uncomfortable moment and then filed the information in a place he didn't look at often. He had his skills. He had his judgments. He had his room. On a Thursday morning in October, he looked at the man in the gray jacket and faded jeans and reached his conclusion in approximately the time it took the front door to close behind him. He crossed the floor. He said what he said. He waited for the redirect to complete itself the way it always did, with the other person choosing to leave in a way that preserved everyone's dignity. The man in the gray jacket looked at him and did not leave. His name was Miles Garrett. He was 24 years old. He had been working at Harrington and Cole for 7 months, hired through a workforce development program that the store participated in as part of its community relations commitments. He worked weekends and 2 weekdays. He was finishing a degree in business administration at Cal State LA, taking 2 classes a semester, paying as he went, which meant he was going slowly, and that the going was, at present, considerably harder than he let most people know. He had $22 in his checking account. Rent was due in 9 days. He had a textbook he'd borrowed from a classmate because he couldn't afford his own copy, and he was behind on a paper for his marketing class because his hours at the store had increased in September, and something had had to give. He was standing at the back service counter when Keanu Reeves walked through the door. He recognized him the way you recognize something that has been a constant in your life, as you can remember. His mother had loved those films. The ones from the 90s, when the world had been a different shape and his mother had been young enough that Friday night movies were still something she did for herself rather than for other people. She had taped them. Actual VHS tapes, labeled in her handwriting, stacked on a shelf in the apartment in Inglewood where Miles had grown up. He had watched those films with her more times than he could count. He knew the face. He would have known it anywhere. He set down the polishing cloth. He watched Preston Hale cross the floor with the particular stride he used. Miles had a name for it, privately, the assessment walk. He had seen it deployed before. On a young man in basketball shoes who had come in to buy something for his girlfriend and left without buying anything, because the interaction had been managed just carefully enough to make him feel like it wasn't worth the trouble. On an older couple on a Sunday, the man in a good suit and the woman in a church hat, who had been so gently and so thoroughly redirected that they had left, smiling, somehow at the exit, as though the decision had been theirs. Each time, Miles had said nothing. Each time, he had felt the stone of it in his stomach and carried it home and thought about it, and come back the next shift and said nothing again. He had told himself that it wasn't his place, that he was new, that he needed the job, that the world was full of moments that weren't yours to fix, and that the skill of understanding which moments were yours was something you developed over time, and that he was 24 and still developing it. He had believed this, or had managed to believe it, until he watched Preston Hale stand in front of Keanu Reeves and tell him to step outside. Then he stopped believing it. Something happened inside Miles Garrett in that moment that he would spend years trying to describe accurately. It wasn't heroism, exactly. It wasn't even calculated courage, the kind where you weigh the cost and decide the action is worth it. It was simpler than that and less comfortable than that. It was the sensation of arriving, very suddenly and with complete clarity, at the absolute end of your ability to do nothing. He stepped away from the counter. He crossed the floor. He kept his voice steady. "Mr. Reeves." The words came out clean and level and carried across the silent room in a way that surprised him. "Welcome to Harrington and Cole. I'm Miles. How can I help you today?" Several things happened at once. Preston turned. For a fraction of a second, less than a breath, barely visible, something moved across his face. Not recognition of who Keanu was, something else. The expression of a man who has run a very precise calculation and gotten an answer his model didn't predict. The woman at the far end of the display case, a retired teacher named Dorothy Albright, who had been browsing without any particular urgency for the past 20 minutes, sat up very slightly in her chair. The two men near the window, who had been examining a display of dress watches, went still. A couple near the entrance moved, almost imperceptibly, closer to each other. Jay Sutton, near the door, relaxed by about 5%. If you knew how to read him, that was considerable. And Keanu Reeves looked at Miles Garrett. There are moments of recognition between two people that have no adequate name. Not friendship, not gratitude. Something older and more specific than either of those things. The look of one person saying to another across a room, "I see exactly what you just did, and I see exactly what it is costing you." Miles felt it move through him like a current. "I'm looking for something specific," Keanu said. His voice was quiet, unhurried. He spoke the way he moved, without announcing himself. "A Patek Philippe. One of the older dress pieces. Simple dial. I have a friend who mentioned one she'd seen in an auction catalog." "Calatrava," Miles asked. "That's the one. We have two in the case. Both vintage. I'd like to show them to you." He moved toward the display case. Preston stepped forward, positioning himself with the precise geometry of someone reasserting territory. Mile. His voice was careful, cotton-wrapped. "I've already spoken with this gentleman." "I understand," Miles said. He did not look at his manager. He kept his attention on the case. His hands were steady. He would notice this later and be surprised by it. "I've got this, Mr. Hale." The silence that followed was a different silence from the one before. The first had been the silence of shock. This one was the silence of a room that has decided to witness something. Miles removed the first watch from the case with both hands, the way he'd been trained, and set it on the velvet pad. He talked about it the way you talk about something, when you understand it and care about it. The Calatrava design that had originated in the 1930s, named for a 12th century Spanish military order, whose symbol was a simple cross. The way Patek Philippe had been making this particular model, with variations, for longer than most luxury gift manufacturers had been in continuous existence. The movement, which was manually wound and which required, unlike almost everything else in the modern world, the particular daily action of a bins who had attentions of a person who had decided that some things were worth tending. Who wind? He talked about the case proportions, the way the thin bezel created a face that was, in the truest sense of the word, legible, not decorative, not demonstrating, just present and clear in the way of things made without agenda. He talked about the dial, cream, slightly aged, the kind of warmth that comes from decades of existing in the same atmosphere as the person who wore it. Keanu listened without interrupting. He leaned forward slowly and looked at the watch for a long moment. Then he reached out one hand and rested a single finger against the edge of the case, barely touching. The gesture of someone who is not in a hurry. He thought about Eleanor Voss touching a page in an auction catalog with one finger, lightly, without asking for anything. "This one," he said quietly. He said it the way you say something when the decision was already made, and the process was just confirmation. Miles wrote the sale with hands that were, he would notice later, entirely steady. Keanu answered every question without impatience, without performance, without a single reference to who he was or any of the thousand things the situation had made available to him. He was simply a person buying a watch for someone he cared about. That was all. That was the whole of it. When Miles handed over the box, dark wood lined in ivory satin, the Harrington and Cole seal pressed into the lid, Keanu took it in both hands. He looked at Miles, not at the box, at Miles. "Thank you," he said, "for doing your job." 5 words, plain and clean and without decoration. Dorothy Albright, at the far end of the display case, pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling. Because everyone in that room understood that those 5 words were not about a watch. They were not about a transaction. They were about a 24-year-old man who had stood at the edge of something difficult and had stepped forward into it rather than away from it. Who had chosen, in a moment when the easier choice was right there and no one would have blamed him for taking it, to do the thing that his conscience required. They were about the rarest and most necessary act one person can perform for another. The simple, deliberate decision to see someone, to treat them as though they were the full and complete person they were, rather than the assessment someone else had made of them. Keanu walked to the door. Jay held it open. He paused. He turned, just once, and looked at Preston Hale, with an expression that was not anger, not contempt, not the hot and immediate response the situation had been constructed to provoke. Just a look, level and clear and holding nothing back and nothing forward. The look of a man who had decided a very long time ago that this was how he would meet these moments. Not with heat, with clarity. Then he left. The bell above the door rang. The room exhaled. To understand the silence that Keanu Reeves kept in the weeks that followed. The complete, deliberate, total silence. You have to understand something about who he was. Not the public version, which was real enough, but the version that operated in the space between public moments. Most people knew the surface of it. The stories that circulated in Hollywood with the slightly incredulous affection of people who had expected something else. The subway rides. The conversations with strangers that went on longer than they needed to. The way he talked to crew members on sets by name, not just the leads, not just the department heads, everyone, and remembered those names the next time. The tip he had left a waitress in a diner in New Mexico that she had mentioned once to a friend who had mentioned it to someone else, and so it had traveled. What most people didn't know, what operated almost entirely below the surface, was the degree to which Keanu Reeves had spent the better part of 3 decades paying attention to people who didn't expect to be paid attention to, and then doing something about it. He had, over the years, funded Sulish through organizations he preferred not to name, not anonymously in the showy sense of the word. Anonymously in the literal sense, without his name attached to anything. Through foundations, through intermediaries, through the simple process of writing checks and asking for nothing in return, except that the money go where it was meant to go. He had visited hospitals, not for press, not for photographs, because someone had asked him to, or because he had heard about a situation and thought that showing up was the appropriate response to hearing about a situation. He had sat with people in difficult places and talked with them and listened to them and then left without telling anyone he had been there. He had a rule of his own. He had never named it for anyone because it wasn't the kind of thing he felt comfortable naming. But it governed his behavior with a consistency that the people closest to him had come to recognize and rely on. The rule was this: dignity does not require an audience. You did not behave well because someone was watching. You did not treat people with respect because it would be noticed, or rewarded, or circulated. You did it because the alternative, the world in which people were treated as assessments rather than as people, was a world he was not willing to inhabit or contribute to. His mother, Patricia Reeves, a woman who had largely alone and largely in motion, had said something to him when he was young that had stayed in him the way certain things stay in you when you hear them at the right moment with the right ears. She had said, "The quality of a person is not measured by how they treat the people who can help them. It's measured by how they treat the people who can't." He had been 17 years old. He had not fully understood it then. He had grown into it the way you grow into certain things, slowly, and from the inside out, and not without cost. By the time he walked out of Harrington and Cole on a Thursday morning in October, with a dark wood box under his arm and his friend Jay walking quietly beside him, he understood it completely. Miles Garrett was called into Preston Hale's office 38 minutes after Keanu Reeves walked out. He had been expecting it. He sat across from his manager in the small office at the back of the store, with its framed certificates and its photographs of the store at various stages of its history, and he listened to Preston explain that his position was being eliminated, as part of a restructuring of floor staffing responsibilities. The language was careful, the words were precise. Nothing in them connected directly to what had happened on the floor 40 minutes earlier. Miles nodded. He collected his jacket from his locker. He walked out into the October morning on Colorado Boulevard, where the plane trees were beginning to turn, and the light was doing what California light does in October, which is to make everything look like it has already been forgiven for something. He had 19 days until rent was due. He had $22 in his checking account. He had a textbook he needed to return to his classmate and a marketing paper he was behind on, and no job. He stood on the sidewalk and took a breath and felt, beneath the obvious and legitimate fear, something he hadn't expected to feel. He felt clean. Not vindicated, not triumphant, not even certain that what he'd done had been the right calculation, if you were measuring things in the currency of practical outcomes, just clean. The way you feel when you have behaved in accordance with what you actually believe, regardless of what it costs, and you are standing on the other side of it, and the world has not ended. He called his father. He stood on the sidewalk and told him everything. His father, a man named Edward Garrett, who had worked as an electrician in Inglewood for 25 years, and who had a set of principles about how you conducted yourself in the world, that he had transmitted to his son not through speeches, but through the accumulated evidence of his own life. Listen to everything without interrupting. When Miles finished, his father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did right. Now you figure out the next thing." Miles pocketed his phone. He figured out the next thing. What Keanu Reeves did in the 3 weeks after that Thursday morning, he did in silence. Not the performed silence of someone who is planning a reveal. The genuine silence of someone for whom the work itself is the point, and the visibility of the work is not only irrelevant, but would, if he is being honest about it, compromise the thing he is actually trying to do. He made calls, not to journalists, not to entertainment lawyers, not to people who managed reputations or controlled narratives, or could be deployed to shape the way a story was told. He called a woman named Carol Inman. She was 63 years old, and she ran a workforce development organization based in downtown Los Angeles called the Meridian Workforce Collective, named in a quiet, private way after the theater in Vancouver where Keanu had spent his formative years. The organization worked specifically with people in their 20s and 30s who were navigating the financial precarity of working while finishing their education. It matched them with employers, helped them navigate to assistance programs, provided emergency support when the gap between what a person unnavigable and the gap they needed navigurned and what they needed became unliable. Keanu had been a founding donor of the collective 12 years earlier. His name was not on the website. It was not on any of the materials. He had asked for this specifically, and Carol Inman had honored it specifically. He told Carol about Miles Garrett. He told her as much as he knew, which was the broad shape of the situation. A young man working his way through school who had done something that required real courage and had lost his job for it. He asked if the collective could look into it. Carol said she would have something by Monday. He made a second call, this one to a man named Robert Alcott, who was a retired professor of organizational behavior from the Anderson School at UCLA, and who had spent 22 years studying the psychology of business in high-end retail environments. A man who had, over the course of those 22 years, developed training programs for several luxury retail chains that had been described by people who worked in the industry and were honest about it as the most effective of their kind in the country. Not because they shamed anyone. Robert Alcott did not believe in shame as a tool. He had, in fact, written a paper about why shame was counterproductive in this specific context, and why lasting change required something different from shame. It required people to understand how they had arrived at their biases, what those biases were costing them, and what their professional and personal lives looked like in a world where they had genuinely chose to operate differently. His programs were long, they were rigorous, they were not comfortable, and they worked. Keanu explained what he was thinking. Robert Alcott listened. Then he said he would put together a proposal. The third thing Keanu did was direct and personal, and had nothing to do with systems or programs or organizations. He wrote a letter. It was handwritten, 4 paragraphs long, on plain paper. He wrote it at the kitchen table in his house in the Hollywood Hills on a Sunday evening, with a cup of tea going cold beside him and the particular quiet of a house where someone is trying to find exactly the right words for something. He did not find the right words entirely. He found adequate words, words that pointed at the right things without quite touching them, which is perhaps the most that words can ever do. The letter said that the writer had watched a young man make a difficult choice in a small room, and that the choice had been seen. It said that courage in ordinary moments is rarer than courage in famous moments and worth more, because ordinary moments are where most of life actually happens. It said that the world needed people who stepped forward when they had every reason not to, and that the writer had been thinking since Thursday morning about what that step had cost, and wanted to do something about the cost. It said, "I'd like to help you finish what you started." He placed in the envelope with the letter a check. The amount covered 2 full years of remaining tuition and fees at Cal State LA, textbooks, and a reasonable monthly stipend to replace the income from the job that Miles had lost. He also included an invitation to meet, if Miles wanted, for coffee. No agenda, no performance, just a conversation between 2 people who had been in the same room on the same morning and had each done what they did. Jay Sutton drove to Miles Garrett's apartment in Eagle Rock on a Tuesday afternoon and knocked on the door on the 2nd floor. Miles did not open the envelope immediately. He set it on his kitchen table and looked at it for a while. Perhaps because he understood, from the weight and the handwriting and the return address, that whatever was inside it was going to require something of him, and he wanted to be ready for it. When he opened it, he read the letter slowly. He read it 3 times. Then he called his father. He read Edward Garrett the letter over the phone, every word. Sitting on the floor of his apartment with his back against the kitchen cabinets, while his father listened from the house in Inglewood where Miles had grown up, and where the same photograph of his parents on their wedding day still hung in the same place, above the same sideboard. When Miles finished, his father was quiet for almost a full minute. The silence between a father and a son, who have arrived at the same understanding without needing to name it. Then Edward Garrett said, "Son, that man watched you for 30 seconds and saw who you are. Now you make sure he's right." Miles cashed the check. He called his classmate about the borrowed textbook. He paid his rent. He submitted the marketing paper, late but complete, and received a B+ from a professor who noted in the margin that the analysis was strong, but would have benefited from more time. He sent a response to the address on the letter. Brief, honest, without flourish. He said he would like to have that coffee. They met on a Wednesday morning at a diner near Silver Lake that Keanu had been going to for years. A small place, linoleum floors, the kind of coffee that arrives in a thick ceramic mug and is reliably excellent without ever having been described that way anywhere. The kind of place that exists specifically so that people can have conversations without being observed. They talked for 2 hours. Miles talked about the morning, about the assessment walk, about the times he had watched it happen before and had said nothing and had carried that silence home, and what it had felt like over time, about what had been different on Thursday, about the sensation, which he found difficult to articulate, of arriving at the end of your capacity to do nothing. Keanu listened with the particular quality of attention that the people who knew him well recognized as one of his most significant characteristics. He did not listen the way people listen when they are waiting for a pause so they can speak. He listened the way you listen, when the other person's words are the most important thing in the room. He talked in turn about Eleanor Voss, about the Meridian stage and what it had been for him at 19, about the thing Eleanor had said to him about doing something right without knowing what it was, about how he had spent 30-something years trying to understand what she had meant and had arrived, slowly, at something like an answer. He said, "I think she meant that the most real things you do are the things you do before you know you're doing them. Before you've had time to calculate the value of the action or worry about how it appears. The thing you do when there's no audience, not even yourself." Miles thought about that. "Is that what I did?" he asked. "I think so," Keanu said. "I think you moved before you had time to think about it. And then you had time to think about it, and you kept moving anyway, which is a different kind of courage." Miles looked at his coffee. "I thought about my dad," he said, finally, "about how he's been a certain person his whole life, regardless of what it cost him, and about how I've been watching that my whole life and telling myself I was learning from it." He paused. It felt like it was time to find out if I actually had. The check came. Keanu paid it, which Miles allowed, which cost him something, because allowing other people to do things for you requires a kind of trust that is harder for some people than giving. They shook hands outside on the sidewalk. Keanu looked at Miles for a moment with the quiet directness that people who had worked with him described as his most disarming quality. "Keep going," he said. "That's all it is. Just keep going." Miles drove home through Silver Lake and Echo Park and Rampart Village with the windows down and the October air coming in, and thought about what it meant to live in a way that could be recognized in 30 seconds by a stranger. He thought that was probably the most important question he had ever considered. What happened at Harrington and Cole in the months that followed was, in most respects, the opposite of dramatic. The Harrington and Cole parent company, a luxury retail group headquartered in San Francisco called Pacific Crest Holdings, had been made aware of the incident within 48 hours of its occurrence, not through social media, not through a press story, through an internal channel, a formal complaint filed with the company's HR Department by Dorothy Albright. The retired teacher who had been sitting at the far end of the display case, who had watched everything, and who had gone home that evening and written 3 careful pages about what she had witnessed. Dorothy Albright had been a high school English teacher for 31 years. She wrote with precision and without sentimentality. Her complaint, named Preston Hale by name, described his conduct in specific detail and concluded with a paragraph that the HR director at Pacific Crest Holdings would later describe to a colleague as the clearest articulation of tall problem she had ever encountered in a workplace document. Dorothy had written, "What I witnessed was not an isolated incident. The behavior I observed had the quality of practiced habit. The ease and speed with which Mr. Hale moved to exclude a customer based solely on his appearance suggested a pattern, not a moment. The damage done is not only to the specific customer involved, who is certainly capable of managing the experience. The damage is to every person who walks through that door and receives with equivalent smoothness and equal lack of justification the message that they do not belong. Some of those people have no one in the room to say otherwise." Pacific Crest Holdings conducted an internal review. The review found that Preston Hale had implemented what he described in his own documentation as clientele management protocols that were not sanctioned by company policy, and that reflected, as the review's conclusion put it, a pattern of appearance-based exclusion. It's inconsistent with the values of the organization. Preston Hale was terminated. He did not go quietly. He filed a grievance. He spoke to a labor attorney. He maintained for a period of weeks that he had been made a scapegoat for industry-wide bad practices that everyone tacitly endorsed, and that his own conduct had been no different from that of 100 other managers in 100 other stores. Some of this was true. Some of it was rationalization. The two things lived together in Preston's understanding of events in a way that made them difficult to separate, which was, in a sense, the root of the problem. He found another position eventually, in a smaller store in a less prominent location, for less money. He brought his skills. He brought his instincts. He brought the assessment walk. What changed slowly and at real cost, and not in any way that produced the visible, clean arc of transformation that stories are supposed to produce, was his understanding of those skills, of what they were actually measuring, of the distance between the story he told himself about who belonged in his room and the reality of the people he had been dispatching to somewhere else. It did not change all at once. It changed the way things actually change, in fragments over time, under pressure, with setbacks, with the particular resistance of a person who has organized their professional identity around a skill they are being asked to recognize as something other than what they thought it was. A year after losing his position at Harrington and Cole, Preston Hale enrolled in a professional development course at UCLA Extension. He would later say, to someone who asked, that he hadn't entirely known why he'd signed up. He knew, in the part of himself he was most reluctant to look at, that he had recognized, over those 12 months, a pattern in his own behavior that he could no longer explain away to his own satisfaction. He completed the course. He completed a second one. He would not describe what followed as transformation. He was not that kind of person, and he did not trust that kind of language. He would describe it, if pressed, as a sustained effort to become, in specific and practical ways, less wrong. It was unglamorous. It was slow. It did not make for a satisfying story. It was, perhaps, the most honest thing he had ever done. Robert Alcott's proposal reached Pacific Crest Holdings 6 weeks after the incident. It came through an intermediary, a business development contact, who described it as an opportunity that had come to the organization's attention and that the organization might wish to consider. The proposal outlined a comprehensive training program for all floor and management staff at Pacific Crest Holdings' 17 locations nationwide. The program was designed not to shame, not to enforce compliance, but to genuinely examine the psychology of assumption, how it forms, what it costs, and what a professional and personal life organized differently actually looks like. The program was offered at no cost to Pacific Crest Holdings. The funding came from a private foundation. The name of the private foundation's primary donor was not on any document that Pacific Crest Holdings received. The company's CEO, when she asked her contact about the donor, was told only that it was someone who had a personal interest in seeing the work done well. She approved the program. It ran for 4 years. It reached every one of Pacific Crest Holdings' locations. It was later cited in a trade publication about luxury retail as one of the most effective examples of bias reduction training in the industry. The article did not name the person who had funded it. The watch reached Eleanor Voss on her 73rd birthday. Keanu had driven to Vancouver himself, not with an assistant, not with arrangements made by anyone else. He had flown up on a Wednesday morning and driven a rental car through streets he knew from a different version of his own life, past the waterfront and through the neighborhood where the Meridian stage still stood in its converted warehouse. The sign, in the same place it had always been, the building slightly more weathered, the street considerably more fashionable. Eleanor's apartment was 3 blocks from the theater. She had lived there for over 30 years. He knocked on the door. She opened it. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, the way she had looked at him since he was 19 years old, with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who had spent decades looking at people for a living and had no patience for the performance of a face. "You drove," she said. "I drove. Come in." They sat in her kitchen, where the morning light came through the window that faced east and where the shelves were crowded with the accumulated visual record of a life in theater. Programs, photographs, books, small objects that meant things only to the person who had chosen to keep them. She opened the box with careful hands. She lifted the watch from its cushion and held it on her palm and looked at it for a long time. The rose gold case, the clean, cream-colored dial, the movement that required daily the deliberate attention of a person who had decided that some things were worth tending. She didn't ask what it had cost. She didn't ask how he had found it. She looked up at him. "Do you remember what I said to you?" she asked. "At the beginning, you said I was doing something right without knowing what it was. And do you know now?" He thought about it. He thought about a Thursday morning in October, and a young man stepping forward, and the silence of a room paying complete attention. "I think so," he said. "I think it's just being there. Actually being there." Eleanor smiled. It was the smile of a teacher who has watched someone say the thing they have been waiting for years to hear. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly it." She put on the watch. The rose gold caught the kitchen light. She wore it every day after that. Miles Garrett graduated from Cal State, LA the following May. He was 25 years old. His father and his mother sat in the third row of the auditorium on a warm spring morning and watched him cross the stage. His mother cried, which she had told herself she would not do, and which she did immediately and completely the moment his name was read. His father did not cry. He sat very straight and very still and watched his son with the expression of a man who has been working toward a moment his whole life and is now inside it and is trying to make sure he remembers every detail. Miles had been offered a position in the community development division of a commercial real estate company in downtown Los Angeles. He negotiated the offer with more confidence than he had expected to feel, which he attributed, at least partly, to a diner in Silver Lake that he thought about more often than he would have predicted. He'd taught Ed he have predicted. He and Keanu had stayed in contact. Not frequently, not with ceremony. The way people stay in contact when something real passed between them once and neither of them has forgotten it. A message on a birthday, an occasional exchange when something happened that one of them wanted to share. The particular quality of friendship that does not require maintenance because it was built on something that does not erode. Miles had a rule of his own now. He told it to people who worked for him as his career progressed, and as the people reporting to him grew younger and more uncertain in the ways that young people are uncertain when they are still figuring out who they are going to be. He told them, "You will spend your career being given reasons to look away from things. Good reasons. Practical reasons. You need this job. You can't afford the fight. It's not your place. Someone else will handle it. Those reasons are real. They will always be real. And you will have to decide, in the specific moment, whether they are good enough. My advice is to decide early, before the moment. Decide in advance who you are going to be when it costs something. Because the moment always arrives faster than you expect, and it never looks the way you thought it would." He paused. "Always. Here. Letting the weight of it sit. Step forward. Not because someone will see you. Not because it will pay off. Not because the story will end the way you hope. Step forward because you will have to live for the rest of your life with the memory of the moment you chose not to." Dorothy Albright, the retired teacher who had watched everything from the far end of the display case and then gone home and written 3 careful pages about it, framed Priya Harmon's article from the Pasadena Star-News when it ran. Priya was a young journalist who covered the business beat and who had, in the course of reviewing a public filing related to a non-profit workforce development grant, come across a paper trail that led her, after 4 days of phone calls and source interviews and 2 walks down Colorado Boulevard, to the full shape of what had happened. Her story ran on a Saturday morning. It was careful. It was thoroughly verified. It was written with the specific restraint of a journalist who understood that the story was powerful enough on its own and did not require amplification. It was shared by end of day, more times than Priya had expected. Dorothy Albright cut it from the print edition and had it framed and hung it on the wall of her living room. She told her daughter it was there to remind her of something she had believed her whole career as a teacher, about the things that actually change people. Not consequences, not punishment, not the external machinery of accountability, which was real and necessary but was never by itself sufficient. What changed people was being seen, truly seen, without agenda, by someone who had no reason to look and chose to look anyway, who had every reason to walk away and chose to stay. That was the act. That was the only act that had ever genuinely worked. Dorothy had spent 31 years in a classroom trying to do that for one student at a time. She was not sure she had always succeeded. She was sure that it was the right work. She looked at the article on her wall. She thought about a Thursday morning in October. She thought, yes, that is exactly what it looks like. There is a photograph in Miles Garrett's office, on the credenza behind his desk. It is not framed dramatically. It is in a simple dark frame, the kind you buy from a hardware store, and it sits among several other photographs without any particular prominence. It was taken by Jay Sutton on the Wednesday morning at the diner in Silver Lake. A candid shot, not staged, not noticed at the time. Two people in a booth with coffee cups on the table between them, leaning slightly forward in the way people lean when a conversation has found its weight. The light from the window falling across both of them without preference. Miles doesn't look at it every day. He is past needing it for that. He looks at it on certain days. The days when the calculation of keeping his head down seems reasonable. When the practical argument for looking away from something has organized itself into a sufficiently convincing case. When he is sitting across from a version of the choice he made that Thursday morning and the stakes feel lower and the reasons to leave it alone feel more persuasive than they should. He looks at the photograph. He thinks about what his father said. That man watched you for 30 seconds and saw who you are. Now you make sure he's right. He steps forward. Eleanor Voss died in late February, 2 years and 4 months after her birthday. She died at home, in the apartment 3 blocks from the Meridian stage, in the early morning, with the particular quietness of people who have been ready for a long time and have made their peace in the way that is available to people who have spent their lives paying attention to what actually matters. Keanu was in London when it happened. He found out from a mutual friend who had been with Eleanor in her last weeks. He sat with it for a while. In the hotel room, in the quiet of the early morning, with the sounds of the city coming in through the window, he thought about a 19-year-old in Vancouver who had walked into a theater not knowing why, and had been told something that had taken 30 years to fully understand. He thought about a watch on a kitchen table in morning light, rose gold, cream dial. He thought about the way Eleanor had looked at him. That direct, unhurried look. The look of a teacher who has already seen the answer in you and is simply waiting for you to find it. He thought, I hope she knew. He believed without being able to prove it and without needing to that she had. The most important things about this story are also the quietest things. The watch. The letter. The program that ran for 4 years in 17 stores and changed, slowly and imperfectly, and at real cost, the way those stores understood their work. None of it was loud. None of it was fast. None of it produced the kind of moment that stories are usually organized around. The single clear turning point, the dramatic reckoning, the before and after that explains itself. What it produced instead was what real change almost always produces, a series of small, sustained choices made by specific people in specific moments that accumulated over time into something larger than any individual action. A 24-year-old who stepped forward, a woman who wrote 3 careful pages, a journalist who followed a paper trail, a retired professor who believed that people could genuinely become less wrong. And a man in a gray canvas jacket who understood, with the certainty of 30 years of living according to a principle his mother had given him, that the quality of a person is not measured by how they treat the people who can help them. It is measured by how they treat the people who cannot. That is the whole of it. That is the story. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below what stayed with you. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.